Hey folks, I recently made a video explaining why I believe 9.1 is WoW's worst patch ever, and I was pretty negative about a lot of the new changes or features. Thankfully, Sanctum of Domination and endgame PvE as a whole are pretty much the only things I'm still playing this game for, so this video should be a lot more positive than the previous one. When it comes to the moment-to-moment gameplay, World of Warcraft shines. I still love raiding in other MMOs, such as Final Fantasy and Guild Wars 2, but the responsiveness of the controls in WoW are second to none. Regardless on how bad the game has gotten, I still live for the thrill of playing my character perfectly and killing a mythic boss that my guild has been working on for hundreds of pulls. Admittedly, the class design has taken a dip in recent years, and that kind of forces me to re-roll every few patches, but I can usually find a spec or class that I enjoy raiding with. Lastly, when it comes to boss design, the Warcraft team has been firing on all cylinders as of late. Sure, there are some duds like Council of Blood or Stone Legion Generals, but overall, the encounter design in Shadowlands and recent expansions has been pretty phenomenal. Seeing how intense and well-designed the Sylvanas fight is especially gives me motivation on its own to keep playing. Now, I may not be a world-first raider, but I'd like to still think that I have a lot of experience with raiding at a high level. Since Legion, I've at least attempted to push pretty far into Mythic each tier, and, well, some tiers I end up getting cutting edge, others I burn out in the last few bosses due to guild drama or boredom. That being said, I can confidently say that I've had a strong understanding of what each raid tier has demanded of the top level players. As a result, I began to notice a problematic trend. As the game has progressed, the amount of effort required from players outside of the raid has been dramatically increasing. Now, many people will argue that even back during Legion, you were still forced to grind quite a lot in order to stay viable, and this is still completely true. Although it had a fantastic raid lineup, minus Emerald Nightmare, it also had one of the worst legendary systems for over half of its lifetime. People will cite Time Forging as another problematic system, but I really don't think it was that bad, because the chances of getting a good Titan Forge piece were so low that you never really had it be a concern for top-end raiders. You really only ever noticed the system when it ended up benefiting you. Ironically, the largest complaint that I've heard about Legion is that you needed to farm +2 Mauve Souls to grind out artifact power, but this was something that barely lasted a patch and was completely irrelevant for the vast majority of the expansion, so I don't really think it was that big of a deal. Also, the infinite artifact weapon trait is another thing that I hear people bring up, but the reality is that this was an extremely minor DPS increase, and it was something in the realm of like less than 0.5% per rank, so the majority of players didn't care about it at all. Now, Legion may have had its problems, but I think we can all agree that Battle for Azeroth is when things really started to go downhill. Compared to artifact weapons, Azerite armor was even more frustrating to grind, as you needed more and more power to unlock traits as you increased the item level on your gear. The biggest issue by far, though, was the lack of deterministic gear acquisition, at least during the early patches. Not every piece of Azerite gear had the traits that you wanted, and some of them were massive damage increases, meaning you had to RNG into the exact piece that you wanted or you were screwed until the next lockout. This had some very strong Legion Legendary vibes to me, with the primary difference being that Legion Legendaries actually meaningfully changed your playstyle, whereas Azerite traits were by and large a passive damage increase or proc. Then, as we all know, they decided they were going to introduce Azerite Essences during 8.2. Most people will likely have varying opinions on this system, because the acquisition of essences ranged from laughably easy to extraordinarily difficult depending on your class. Some classes were able to enter Ashara's Eternal Palace with all of their best-in-slot essences already acquired, while other people had to farm the raid or other external sources, sometimes including PvP, for weeks. For instance, the essence from Arenas, Conflict and Strife, was best in slot for a few specs as a major, the one I played included, but it was also best in slot for a lot of other classes, especially tanks, as a minor. This meant that I was forced to farm arenas for weeks on end to get an upgrade that I wanted for raid. You know, I have nothing against arenas, I'm not trying to knock people who enjoy them, but they're simply not the type of content that I play this game for. I strongly dislike when Blizzard forces PvE players into PvP content, and my PvP friends have told me that they feel the exact same way when they're forced to enter a raid for a trinket that's mandatory in arenas. Another more minor thing that was added during 8.2 was benthic gear, and while this may seem completely irrelevant to most people, it was actually quite impactful for anybody that was looking to maximize their damage in mythic raids. Despite being somewhere in the realm of 30 item levels lower than mythic raid pieces, the proc effects in them were best in slot by a large amount for the vast majority of classes. This meant that many mythic raiders were forced to farm Nazjatar a ton in order to get all of their best in slot benthic gear. And then we come to patch 8.3, which is probably the only one that rivals 9.1 in terms of gearing frustrations. Anybody who played during this patch is well aware of how incredibly frustrating obtaining ideal corruption pieces was. While I will admit that once I actually had my full Twilight Devastation set, I had a lot of fun blasting apart AoE packs with gigantic laser beams, but it did take me a long time to get there. And honestly, instead of ranting about a broken system from last expansion that everybody already knows about, I'm just going to let that segue me into my next point regarding Shadowlands. Once you actually get to the combat, Shadowlands is pretty goddamn fun. I mean, hell, even Covenant abilities, which I have a lot of problems with in terms of design, can be really fun when you actually use them. When I do a giant pull as a protection warrior and slap down a buffed up Ancient Aftershock, it feels extremely rewarding. The same can be said about pretty much every Covenant ability in the game. They're extremely thematic and really fun to use, and I have no complaints in regards to that. No, the problem with Covenant abilities lies entirely in their balance, and that's just not something which will affect the casual players. I've had a lot of people tell me that they think I'm overreacting, and that Covenants are a perfectly fine system. This might be true for a casual player who cares more about a cool, fun ability than a meaningful % damage increase, but it does cause a massive problem for Mythic Raiders. If you want to see how this is a problem, all you need to do is look at the state of mages right now. Currently, Kyrian is Bis for Arcane, Nightfae is Bis for Fire, and Venthyr is Bis for Frost. Now, Kyrian and Venthyr are both solid options for all three specs, but ultimately, you'll need to make a decision that will limit your ability to maximize damage on 2 of your 3 other specs. Since Covenant swapping isn't really viable now, mages are just forced to eat the damage loss if they plan on multi-speccing. Ultimately, this is a little bit of a minor gripe, and I do have a few other issues with Covenants, but I'll save that for another video, as they're not incredibly important in the context of what I want to discuss here. The main issue in regards to entering raids in Shadowlands is the ridiculous level of external farming demanded of players, especially with the introduction of domination sockets. Now, when discussing raid preparation in Shadowlands, there are 2 distinct scenarios that I think are worth mentioning. An already geared player trying to increase his power to help his raid, and a new player trying to get caught up. Since it applies to both categories, I'll start by talking about what you need to do once you're already geared. So, for the sake of this explanation, just assume you're on a character that is fresh out of Mythic Nathria, and you've just begun to progress through Sanctum of Domination. Your item level is likely somewhere around 226, your conduits, assuming you farm Maw every week, are at the same level, and one of your slots will probably contain a 235 item level legendary. The first thing you need to determine is whether or not you're actually going to recraft your legendary, which is something that a lot of players were forced to do, as I mentioned in my previous video. This means that you'll either need to spend a large chunk of your stockpiled Soul Ash, or you'll need to farm low-level Torghast layers to eventually get enough. Even if you don't need to recraft your legendary, you'll still be forced to do layer 12 Torghast twice a week in order to get the soul cinders that you'll need to upgrade your legendary even further. Now, twice a week you'll also need to add in the Covenant Assault, and once a week you'll need to do the Tormentors of Torghast event, as they also provide you with soul cinders. Also, you'll want to start farming upgrade tokens for your conduits, as they can be a major DPS increase for many classes. This means that you'll need to complete the Adamant Halls potentially multiple times a week, which requires you to get a flawless Torghast run, and then you need to hope that the Conduit upgrade item actually drops from the final boss of Adamant Vaults. Now, additionally, you'll need to farm Korthia every day for catalog research, which improves your reputation with the Archivist's Codex, allowing you to eventually buy more Conduit upgrades. Sockets are a bit more of a min-maxing thing for most classes, but if you do care about that, you'll effectively need to double the amount of farming, because they're from the exact same sources as Conduit upgrades. Now, if you want to upgrade your legendary once you've acquired the requisite amount of Soul Ash, you have 2 options. One, you can craft it, which requires farming materials, some of which are daily locked in Korthia, or you can farm gold in order to buy it off the auction house. Now, after your guild has finally started killing raid bosses, you may or may not have actually gotten loot, since in Shadowlands, they greatly reduce the amount of loot that drops in raids. Now, in order to keep up with the higher level guild, you'll likely be forced to farm Mythic Plus, and then upgrade some of your drops with Valor. Now, lastly, Shards of Domination and Sockets of Domination can only be acquired as a completely random drop within the new raid, Sanctum of Domination, so if you didn't happen to get any from your raid, you're shit out of luck. There's literally nothing you can do inside or outside of raid to increase your chances of progressing within this system. Oh, and it can result in a 10% overall damage increase or more, to the point where Limit Max and Roger Brown both mentioned that they were actually forced to sit players during the World First race because they got unlucky with Shards of Domination. Whew. Now, if everything I just mentioned sounds completely exhausting, you might understand what it feels like to raid at a mythic level. Keep in mind, this is all the stuff that you need to do once you're already there. Actually reaching the point where you can enter mythic raiding is even harder. For starters, you'll need to farm your gear up to roughly 220 item level, as before that point you'll have a hard time getting invited to anything. And this is actually absurdly difficult, and even on my character that is currently 232 with 9 out of 10 heroic bosses killed, I still have an extremely hard time getting invited to groups. It's been a bit of an eye-opening experience, honestly, playing in patch 9.1, because all my friends and former guildmates have quit, so it's one of the first times in a while where I've been forced to entirely pug my way through content. It's kind of made me realize how brutal of an experience it can actually be. Now, as long as you're a good player who's confident in your class, you'll generally be fine in a guild group, even if you have a lower item level. Everybody already knows you, so they'll have no issues bringing you along and helping you catch up on gear, since they're well aware that you'll be pulling your weight, but pug groups have no way of evaluating players other than their item levels and parses. So that means you pretty much need to be looking for the absolute most geared people possible in a pug group to ensure that there's no chance of failing. Just to be clear, I don't fault pug groups for having this mentality, because it's absolutely the most logical way of approaching things. The problem isn't the pug groups, it's the flawed gearing systems that encourage this behavior while also providing players with no alternatives for being raid ready. Korthia gives absurdly low item level loot and forces you to use cataloged research in order to upgrade your gear to an LFR level. This is the same currency, by the way, that, as I mentioned earlier, you need in order to reliably upgrade your conduits, which makes this form of gearing extremely inefficient in the long term. Not only that, it's so absurdly expensive to actually buy this catch-up gear with cataloged research that most people probably won't even bother. The only other realistic way that a new player could catch up is by farming like LFR and low-level Mythic each week until they're able to reliably get into normal raid groups. Alternatively, they can try and join a normal progression guild, which I recently learned is something that exists, and maybe they can obtain some gear that way, but ultimately a lot of these methods simply aren't appealing for casual players, or people that just want to quickly jump into Mythic raiding. This is where a really, really unfortunate choice is subtly forced upon players. Either do all of this insane farming, quit the game, or take your credit card and buy a boost. And honestly, it's no secret that boosting is extremely bad right now. And I think after hearing me go over the new player experience, you can understand why. It's easy for people like myself, who have traditionally been on Mythic progression teams for years, to not really understand what it's like to raid outside of their own bubble. For me, raiding has always involved hopping into a group with my buddies and farming whatever I need in order to help us kill the next raid boss. Boosting was never even a question for me, because I already had a group of people that I ran with all the time, so I was never concerned about not being able to clear content. But once you actually have to experience the grind of pugging on your own with nobody else to help you, it becomes extremely obvious why the vast majority of players choose to boost instead. In my opinion, this system benefits nobody. The vast majority of casual players will simply end up burning themselves out before they ever reach raiding, which means they're quitting WoW without actually getting to experience the parts of the game that make it so good. The people buying the boosts probably don't want to be spending real money, but they feel forced to because of the way the game is designed. I'm sure that they would just be far happier if they could have an easier path to entering Mythic raids. As far as the people selling the carries, they don't care either way, and this is coming from somebody who's been selling raid and dungeon carries for years now. Even without the massive boosting epidemic that we now face, sellers will still find a way to make gold, and personally, I've been using it as a way to fund my game time ever since Warlords of Draenor. I should also quickly note that I want to make a distinction between people selling for gold and selling for real money. If you're selling for real money, I don't give a shit what happens to you. I hope Blizzard bans you, because it's just kind of unethical in my opinion. If you're selling for gold, whatever. Like I said, I've been doing that since WoD. It's fine. There are many, many, many different ways to sell for gold. But I really don't think that all of this was an intentional design choice by Blizzard. A lot of people like to create conspiracy theories that say, oh, they're trying to increase the sales of tokens so that people buy boosts. But if you look at how Mythic raid gearing is designed currently, it's already so much of a grind that I can genuinely see this just being an oversight on their part. Alright, so I've spent a good while listing off the current problems that raiders, especially new players, will face, but do I actually have any possible solutions? Well, yeah, I do. The obvious and somewhat smart-ass answer would be to say that they should simply remove a lot of the bloated systems within their game. That said, I do think that most of the systems they've designed have some potential, and if reworked slightly, they could actually add to the enjoyment of raiding, similar to Legion Legendaries. Except for Shards of Domination, fuck everything about that system. Everybody would be much better off if it was literally just deleted from the game and bosses had their health pools reduced proportionally to compensate. But everything else is fine. Almost all of the Covenant abilities are really well designed and fun to use, but it can feel frustrating when you're forced to pick only a single ability. While you can access the others, swapping Covenants is extremely frustrating. This change is simple. Make Covenants purely aesthetic and add the 3 most important Covenant abilities as a talent row to each specialization. Then, you can simply tweak the visual effect depending on your Covenant. For Conduits, just remove ranks. People who want to min-max will still need to farm for sockets, but now you won't need to RNG into the correctly upgraded conduit in order to boost your DPS. For legendaries, there's honestly a lot that can be done to change it, but the easiest one by far would be allow players to at least partially refund existing legendaries in order to make it easier to craft a new one. Additionally, I think that Torghast has the potential to be a really fun place, but it will never reach that potential so long as it's forced into being a vehicle for people to farm Soul Ash. Blizzard, trust me on this, if you make Soul Ash drop from various sources in this game, such as Callings, Mythic Plus, and Raid, and simply design Torghast to be a fun minigame, people will play the shit out of it. The Mage Tower in Legion offered absolutely no gameplay benefits, and yet it's still fondly remembered by pretty much everyone who played that expansion. Also, I love roguelikes. I still play Slay the Spire every now and then when I get bored. It's okay for content to exist within its own little bubble. Make Torghast completely separate from any form of endgame content. Hell, even let people level alts within it, and you will receive massive thanks from your player base. The final and probably most important change that needs to happen is one that I unfortunately don't have a clear answer for, and that's in regards to the new player experience. All I know is that the item level grind needs to be reduced, so possibly consider allowing players to farm better gear within new zones like Horthia to the point where they can at least reliably enter a normal raid and be somewhat competitive. Also, this is going to be an extremely controversial opinion, but I think that LFR and normal raid difficulty should be merged, and that normal raids should be queuable. Now, before you rush to the comments and tell me that I'm insane, hear me out. The current design of LFR is effectively pointless. It may as well be called story mode, as it's usually impossible to fail a boss, and the gear it drops is so insignificant that it's not worth farming. The main concern with a normal raid queue would be that the average player wouldn't be good enough to handle it, but I honestly doubt this, because I've seen it work in Final Fantasy XIV. In that game, you only have 2 raid difficulties, which can roughly be equated to normal and mythic. While there is something that's equivalent to heroic, it's a little bit different and it's not important for this point. The normal mode in FF14 is queuable, and while it's relatively easy, it's not completely face roll, and I have seen groups wipe to it. That said, there are solid daily rewards for doing a random raid boss each day, meaning that veteran players will be encouraged to join these groups and help out. The end result is that most new players are able to experience slightly challenging raid content without the risk of actually failing. And honestly, I think this is a far more rewarding experience than LFR is for WoW. Additionally, you won't really see any high-end Final Fantasy players complaining about this system, as they get some pretty nice rewards which can help them gear alts. Lastly, the gear that's dropped from these raids is actually a pretty relevant item level, which in many ways could be considered pre-Savage, the equivalent of Mythic, Bis. The result is a win-win scenario where veteran players get rewards for helping new players, and the new players have an extremely smooth path to endgame raiding. Of course, after finishing these raids, they'll have to search for a team if they want to progress further, but the game has given them all of the tools that they need in order to do this. Whether or not they actually choose to do it is up to them. Now, admittedly, implementing a system like this into World of Warcraft would not be easy, and it would likely take multiple iterations, but I think that in time it would make the experience of new players much better. As I said before, I absolutely love raiding, and at this point it has quite literally become the anchor that is keeping me playing this game. I know that Blizzard may look at some of the suggestions I've made and think, well, that would reduce our playtime metrics. But the reality is that if you get more of the player base hooked on the extremely fun experience of endgame raiding, they'll be even more likely to stay subscribed and continue paying you money. Funny, sometimes the best way to get people to play your game more is to make a game worth playing. The reality is, World of Warcraft already has that game worth playing buried under a mountain of systems. You'll probably want to keep playing once you find it, but the process of getting and staying there is the real problem with raiding in World of Warcraft. As always, thanks for watching, and come back in a few days if you want to see me conduct a more thorough analysis of the Covenant system.